Hi, welcome to Changing Suits. My name's Bal.
And my name's Taj.
Today we've been joined by ladies from the Swindon Domestic Abuse Support Service because we've spoken to a number of listeners who really wanted us to talk about domestic abuse and really look at the signs and see what support is out there. So I just wanted to introduce, so if you could introduce yourself. So we've got Nikki, firstly.
Hi ladies, I'm Nikki. I'm Nikki Aubrey. I'm the chair of the trustees for Swindon Domestic Abuse Support Service.
We've got Charlotte on the line as well.
Hi ladies, my name's Charlotte Gibbon. I am the Community Services and the Children and Young People's Manager at Swindon Domestic Abuse Support Service.
Lovely. So firstly, what we really wanted to touch on is what does Swindon Domestic Abuse Support Services do? So if you could just give us a bit of an introduction as to what you do and what kind of support services you offer.
So that's a great question to start with. Our charity was set up over 40 years ago by a wonderful lady, very well known name in Swindon, called Jenny Manners. And we were one of the first domestic abuse support organisations outside of London. And that's the work that we do. We have 40 very dedicated, skilled, trained staff supporting victims and their families of domestic abuse. And at the heart of the work that we do is our purpose-built refuge. So we have 20 apartments and 2 emergency rooms where women and children can come and live safely with us and be supported by our staff. And we help them on that journey to recovery. Now, not every victim needs to come and live with us in refuge. So we have a large team of support workers. They're called independent domestic violence advisors, and they work out in the community. They're in the local hospital, the Great Western Hospital. We've got 2 staff embedded there. We've got staff that visit a large number of the GP surgeries in Swindon, meeting victims and supporting them out in the community. You'll hear from Charlotte. She runs all of our community work and all the support programs for our children. At any one time, we could have 40 children living with us in refuge. All will have seen and heard things with their parents and their partners experiencing domestic abuse. So we provide help and support to them as well. But more recently, alongside the fact that we don't just work with female victims, we work with male victims as well, and victims from the LGBT community. We also run a couple of programs with perpetrators, so perpetrators of domestic abuse, changing their behaviours, getting them to understand the impact of the abuse. And we as a board believe that's a really important thing to be doing, stopping that reoffending, stopping that escalation of domestic abuse incidents. So we're I suppose, a complete holistic support service in Swindon.
See, when I think of domestic abuse, automatically, and I think this is from media and just generally, I think of females, domestic abuse. Now, how many males do you have coming to the service?
I would say roughly between about 3 and 5% of all the victims and survivors that we support are male. So it's a really, really low number. And there are many reasons why that number is really low, but we would actively encourage anyone to pick up the phone and call us for support.
Do you think one of the reasons why it's low for males is because almost like the man is portrayed as the one that is the strong one and doesn't want to go for help? Is that one of the reasons why males don't ask for help?
Yeah, I definitely think that is one of the reasons. When you think about, the stereotype that men should be able to stand up for themselves and that men are the stronger out of the two. But I also think there's very much a culture of thinking that they're not going to be believed. Often we can think that, as a male victim coming forward, because we know that domestic abuse is a gendered crime and that the majority of domestic abuse is perpetrated by men against women, I think it's that, for a man to actually think, okay, well, I'm going to put myself out there, and it's a really big thing for anybody to ask for support anyway, but then to have that added complexity of thinking, oh, well, actually, I'm not going to be believed. I think that's quite a big barrier as well.
Before we go further into this, because it is quite an interesting one in regards to the fact that male domestic abuse is starting to get a lot more coverage in the media and so on and so forth, I just want to ask one question. What is domestic abuse? Let's go right back to the start. And I know I'm pulling the conversation back, but what would you define as domestic abuse?
It's never just one thing. Domestic abuse always comes back down to the point of power and control. So where a perpetrator is exercising power and control over their victim, and that can sometimes start off really small, and then it can escalate into much bigger and more dangerous things. Coercive control itself being, we hear a lot now about coercive control, which has actually now become a crime, because coercive control is very much, it's about having complete control over a person, and whether it's the threat of physical or sexual violence or the actual act of physical or sexual violence. And then it can come down to things like, controlling what that person wears, who do they see, how much money are they allowed to have, controlling their ability to parent, basically taking away choices and taking away freedom and everything that whenever we think about domestic abuse, we always come back to that power and control. And really, it's whatever that looks like for that victim. The minute choices are starting to be taken away from somebody, they are then under the control of their perpetrator. So, it does look different for everybody, but it really does range from things like I say, what they can wear, right through to physical and sexual assault, and sometimes even death.
I think just to add to that as well, one of the big game changers for us last year was the passing of the Domestic Abuse Act. So there had been an awful lot of talk and consultation with government and with domestic abuse organisations, public sector bodies in the last, 5-10 years or more about what is domestic abuse, because it is such a big issue. And our local MP, Robert Buckland, led the domestic abuse bill through Parliament. Several times our charity was referenced for the work that we do in supporting victims. And last year, this very important statute actually got onto our books, which for the first time gives a definition of what is domestic abuse. Because, if I talk to my mum about it, her immediate response is domestic abuse is physical violence. And actually we know that whilst that is a very unpleasant form of domestic abuse, I think there are 11 different now definitions of domestic abuse in the Act that have been defined now, and that at least gives some real clarity now around the work that we do and the work that our staff do. The Act's not perfect, but it's a very good starting point now.
What does this Act mean for a victim?
It gives the victims a lot more protection and a lot more rights now. So having got a definition of domestic abuse, that means the statutory bodies are more likely to act if there is an issue or a complaint. One of the I suppose the issue, one of the things that has come out is the necessity now for public sector organisations to provide safe space for victims of domestic abuse. Now that was never a statutory obligation in the past. So somebody fleeing from domestic abuse now has a right to be found and helped in some form of safe accommodation. So there's a number of different responsibilities now enshrined in the Act that protect victims and their families.
And what's taken so long for this Act to come about? Because domestic violence has been there for a very long time. I mean, I'm not even going to give a date because I'm not sure, but you always hear about it. it's come from the past. What has taken government so long to move and act?
It's a good question, and who knows? I think it's a very, very complex subject. It's a subject now I think that people are talking about much more, and particularly since COVID. The fact that it's not acceptable, 20, 30 years ago, you would have heard the phrase, oh, it's only a domestic, we don't get involved. That's just completely unacceptable now.
And that phrase, that's really interesting. You've said that actually, because I hadn't even thought about that. And it is such a, it slips off the tongue quite easily. And I've said it myself as well on the odd occasion. Now you've said it, I'm like, whoa, actually, that's a phrase that we shouldn't find acceptable anyway.
No.
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to ask was, obviously you've come on to the podcast. Our listeners are mainly South Asian. One of the reasons that we had the podcast was really to sort of bring the generation gap and talk about the things from generation of the people that had come from India and other countries up to people that have us, our kids are from the West. We've grown up in the West. Now, where you said your mum said, oh, domestic abuse is physical, again, that's something that I'd think of as well in the past. Obviously, that's changed quite radically. What's your experience in the South Asian community versus perhaps the white community and any other community?
We know in Swindon that about 7% of our population comes from the South Asian community. So it's a growing town. But what we do know from the statistics that we as an organisation keep is that the number of clients that come from that community are nowhere near that 7% number in terms of population size. So we know from the number of incidents of domestic abuse that are reported annually, we know we are not reaching the number of potential victims, potential service users from that community. And with your help, we are hoping that we will start to be able to see and talk to more people from the wider South Asian community.
What kind of estimate would you put in regards to the figures?
So I looked at some figures for you. And if you looked at the period, so this is last year, but in a 3-month period, our staff that were working out in the community in a 3-month period took 184 referrals. Only 5 of those came from the South Asian community.
Oh, wow.
So 3, and from what I can gather from the data, 3 were defined from the Indian community, 1 from the Pakistani. And in terms of refuge, okay, the numbers are much smaller because those victims are higher risk, but the numbers are still very small, less than a handful.
And what's stopping the South Asian community coming forward and talking about this issue?
As Nikki was saying, we do have, the numbers of victims that come through to us, very, very small number. But, domestic abuse victims are frightened. That they are frightened. Domestic abuse does not discriminate. It doesn't have a face. It doesn't, we know full well that, people are frightened to come forward anyway. But when you then add the layers of complexity, such as, things like worrying about, dishonouring families or, my visa, I'm linked to somebody because I've got a spousal visa, for example, all of these different things start to add up. Language barriers, am I going to find somebody that's going to be able to talk to me? Am I going to be able to am I going to be able to communicate what's happening for me? It's very much a case of all these things are barriers. And I think, for victims to come forward anyway is really frightening. But then to think of having all those extra things happening on top, I think it just makes it even more terrifying and even more, frightening that actually not knowing whether the support service is going to be able to support that person effectively.
Do you ladies think that those are the reasons for, potentially the lack of contact?
So I was going to add, so there is an increase of people coming from India, to be honest, and it's been a rise. And we've seen that from our local worship places and just, friends that are coming across that are from India and saying that there's more people that are coming from India. Now, one of the things I would say is a barrier, as you pointed out, is would you understand the situation? Because one thing with counselling is there's not that many South Asians in counselling, and you have to start right at the bottom. You have to start explaining what your family background is and how it works and the mechanics of it. How does your service deal with that? Because I think that's one of the things why the South Asian community doesn't go for services, because it's explaining everything right from the beginning.
I mean, I think education is important. So all our staff have a really good understanding of how to work sensitively, how to work compassionately, and how to really get to know the person that they're supporting. We rely on translator services. We're very specific about not using family members to translate, because we need to make sure that whoever is translating for this person actually has their best interests. So we make sure that we're using translators who are trusted. I think when it comes to things like where we're going to meet people, are we going to meet them somewhere that's safe for them? We use a detailed dash risk assessment. So when we're thinking about domestic abuse and the risk to that person, that covers things like so-called honour-based violence and things like that. So we're really careful to make sure that if we feel that might be happening, we can explore that. We can make the right referrals. We work with other services, so we really work on a multi-agency level to make sure that if somebody we're working with, for example, might not have recourse to public funds. So if that's the case, we will look into how we can support them. Can we get children's services involved? Can we get other organisations to help to fund perhaps stay in refuge, things like that. We work really closely with the Citizens Advice Bureau, so they have a specialist person there who will help us with things like immigration statuses and things like that. So we have a really good grasp, I believe, on how to really sensitively, carefully make sure that we're putting everything in place to make sure that people feel comfortable.
There's two things when you ask the question as to would I agree with the barriers that you've addressed. I mean, from how I'd see it is obviously cultural aspect of it. And that is a massive layer in this. We've come from a community where it is very family orientated, and where we say honour-based, as soon as someone says honour-based, the first thing that jumps into my mind are the honour-based, killings and things like that.
That's what I think, to be honest, Belle. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's got such a negative connotation. However, honour is a big part of the culture, respect and honour, and making sure that there is that respect for the elder generation. So it's really shifting those perspectives, because again, where the East and the Western sort of views are not aligning as much is using languages like that, for example. Nothing wrong with honour, but then the first thing I've thought of, because I'm from the West, is honour-based killing. That's awful. So that's where I'd see it. The other side of it is obviously, not only in the Eastern, but again in the Western as well. You tend to find that the men in the old times did go out to work and were financially more, had the financial backing and had their family. So usually a girl would marry into the family. They may live with their in-laws. They may move to that area. And that still happens now. And then that's where it becomes more and more difficult, because you are surrounded perhaps not with your loved ones, obviously your in-laws, and if that's quite a big thing. And how do you go back to your parents and say, I'm having this problem? And that is a massive issue, not only from people that are coming in from India, Pakistan, but even people that are living here. I know people. Yeah, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, I'm probably going to say exactly the same thing as you, Belle. Quite a lot of victims string their marriage so long because they don't want to hurt their parents, because they're worried that they don't want to upset them, they don't want to let them down. And that's why we've had people, friends, family members that have been married for 13 years, 17 years, just because they didn't want to hurt their parents or their family.
What kind of advice would you give in regards to that? Because I think that is a really key issue here, and it's a tough one.
So I think it's a really difficult question to answer. But if I could give you a parallel, one of the things that we've been doing over the last few years is to be working with older victims in our community, and what we found is that for people that might be in their 60s, 70s, 80s, to actually disclose that there is an issue in their family, that perhaps they've lived with domestic abuse for many years of their married life, and to have to ask for help has been very difficult. And actually during lockdown we had a lady come and live with us who was well into her 80s, and that lady had experienced abuse pretty much all her working life. So I think there are parallels in terms of her and her community, and where her age and how things were when she grew up, and what was expected of her in her role in her family, to why perhaps members of your community also find it difficult to to disclose that information, and that fear of shame, or bringing dishonor to the family or whatever, is very, very hard. And it must have been for her, I'm sure.
What would have, and you don't need to, obviously, we won't go into the specific case, but what would you say is a turning point? Because I can see the parallels, and as soon as you said it, I'm like, yeah, I can see, because it does go back generations, and how the generations are changing, but it's a very slow shift. What was the turning point? Because obviously she's got a family. I'm assuming she'd have a family and big connections, because she lived with this for so long.
I've got a view about, I think, people being able to talk about it much more. My mum talks about it now. My mum's nearly 90. And 5 years ago, 10 years ago, she would never have felt comfortable about talking about it. So I think there is a shift in people feeling more comfortable of saying, this is a problem, we need to do something about it. But it's hard. It's an uncomfortable subject.
Yeah, I think the turning point, I totally agree with Nikki, is that the turning point was for this particular person was that they had somebody to talk to, and access community support in a safe, confidential environment, and was able to say, actually, do you know what, this is happening to me, and is this okay? Is this normal? Is this something that I should just be putting up with? Is this something that, well, I've that old saying of, I've made my bed now, I have to lie in it. And actually for one of our team to be able to turn around and say, absolutely not, it doesn't matter. And I think also being told, you know what, it doesn't matter if you're 80, it doesn't matter if you're 17, 18, 19, 20, 80, you've still got life to live, and actually you deserve to be happy and you deserve to be safe. And I think for this particular lady, it was a turning point of, I do have options, I do have choices, there are people out there that are going to help me. And I think just having the safety net of, we're going to help you to come to a safe place. And I think for her, that was the turning point.
It breaks your heart when you've just said that 80 and she's had to live with it. And it does bring it about. If it's not dealt with, it could be, touch wood, it's not, but it could be a continuous cycle.
What are the reasons why victims continue to stay in these relationships? I know there's probably so many answers that can be given.
There are so many answers. One thing, the biggest reason sometimes can be fear. We know that when somebody tries to leave that relationship, that is the most dangerous time for them. So actually the fear of escalation, what is going to happen to me if I try to leave. But also there are so many other factors. Sometimes, thinking about this lady, she's been in that relationship for so long, she doesn't know anything else. People don't always know that there are services out there that they can access. They've got children, they're feeling they're taking their children away from one of their parents. They might not have access to money. They might not have any independence. Then they might not know how to go to the bank, or how to deal with finances and things like that. And I think it's a case of control has been taken away so long, and somebody else has got power over you. Sometimes I think even the thought of breaking away from that feels actually more frightening than the prospect of staying.
Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, changing_suits, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. One of the other things that I've come across previously is where a victim comes away and says, oh, the signs that you're talking about, that is what happened in my relationship. Whereas when they were in that situation, they hadn't realised it could be classified as domestic abuse. Now, how can we get rid of that problem where people aren't realising that the relationship they're in is perhaps toxic?
I mean, for me, it's education. It's about promoting the services that are out there. I think what Nikki said about, COVID really catapulted domestic abuse into the media, into the limelight. Every other article that we were reading was about, domestic abuse, people trapped in with their victims. So, with their perpetrators, but being able to kind of, know that there are services out there, but also, and part of the work that we're doing at the moment, especially with our children and young people, is for those people to access, education and understanding about healthy relationships, healthy boundaries. What does that look like? Young people who are in, young relationships that are starting to have those kind of signs of things like that happening to them. And I think it's really about early intervention. Getting that education out there, so that we can make people aware as soon as possible that actually that doesn't sound right or that doesn't feel right. And I think it's about making people really self-aware, that they can sort of start to see that, well, hang on a minute, that's happening to me and I feel this way. And starting to understand that, there are support networks out there. So I definitely think education is really, really important, and just making sure that people know that those services are out there.
I think to add to that as well, one of the services that we've developed, in fact, we started to do it during lockdown, was about going much more out into the community, raising awareness of domestic abuse and the support that's available. And when I talk about the community, I also mean within the business world. I mean, that's where I come from, and in any business, there are going to be staff that are impacted by domestic abuse, and if you're a manager and you've got responsibility for your staff, then you should be looking out for their welfare, how they are when they come to work. Are they late? Do they have odd days off work? Do they appear upset or distracted while they're at work? There's all sorts of things that you as a caring employing organisation could do to improve the welfare of your staff and to spot those signs of domestic abuse. So working in the community means lots and lots of different things in terms of raising that awareness, and just being, blunt in a business world. If you've got a member of staff that's suffering from domestic abuse, the chances are they're not doing their job as well as they might be able to. That's going to have an impact on your business. So wouldn't you want to do something about it, if for no other reason other than to get that member of staff working, to their best ability? So there are so many different strands of getting people to understand what it is and what's healthy and what's not healthy. And, that's right the way through from, a young person in education through to, somebody working in a large company anywhere.
You spoke about the signs. For example, say if you had a family member or a neighbour and you thought they were going through domestic abuse, what would you recommend for them to do? What are the steps, or are there any steps?
Because that's actually a really interesting one, because if you do get involved, if you're a neighbour, because you thought this, I mean, from the South Asian community, it could be, why are you getting involved? It's making the situation worse. So
you're the troublemaker.
You're the troublemaker. So it's quite a sensitive topic, as you're well aware, but what would you suggest in regards to that then, where the victim doesn't even want you to be talking about it?
I think I'm very much of the opinion that safeguarding is everybody's business, and I think if we're concerned about someone, I think we need to make ourselves available for people to talk to. There is a very fine line, if we think that something's happening, we have to be careful. Not just because, you know, that person might not want the support, but also we need to make sure that we're not raising the risk to that person. So sometimes, you know, wading in isn't always the right thing to do. But I think, you know, if you do have that relationship with somebody, that you can say, do you know what, I'm gonna give you this phone number. You don't have to use it. You know, I won't mention it again if you don't want me to, but I'm just giving you this phone number. You know, and just pointing someone in the right direction sometimes can be just enough. Or with our helpline, you know, it's making people aware that you can call that number without even having to give your name. And I think if you can provide somebody, if you're worried about somebody and you can be the person that provides them just with that, you know, here's an outlet, here's a safe space, here's a safe phone number, I think that can make all the difference.
I think as well, I mean, our helpline is answered 24 hours a day. There's always somebody there at the end of a phone ready to talk, ready to listen, you know, to offer help, advice, support. So just having that number there, and when the time is right for that person, you know, could be a lifesaver for them.
Say if someone decide they know that they're in an abusive relationship, but yet they continue to stay, do you offer a service in supporting them while they're still in that abusive relationship?
So what I would say is anyone can pick up the phone to the helpline. If somebody called us on the helpline and said, listen, you know, this is happening to me, but I don't want to leave. I'm happy where I am. You know, I'm staying here. I'm not going anywhere. But what can you tell me? What can you advise me? We would always offer somebody safety advice. You know, we would give them you know, some information about how to keep themselves safe. But ultimately, we would be wanting to say to them, you know, when the time is right for you and you feel you're ready to leave, that we are here for you. We do have another project, which I know Nikki mentioned earlier, which is, you know, about behaviour change and family intervention. That does rely very much on both parties in the relationship acknowledging the abuse and wanting to change. But I think if we were talking about somebody who was living with a perpetrator of abuse who actually, you know, isn't acknowledging that they're abusive, and they're doing this very much you know, making sort of a phone call when it's safe to do so, we would give safety advice. But as I said, ultimately we'd be looking to try and help that person to safely exit if and when they were ready.
On that point, how often do you come across a perpetrator who says, actually, this, what I am doing is abuse?
Not as often as we would like.
But again, it goes back to the fact even the victim, like we were saying earlier, doesn't realise they're in an abusive relationship.
Yeah.
So from the other, just looking at it from the other point of view.
Yeah, I mean, we do have that. You know, we do have some perpetrators of abuse who want to change, will acknowledge what's been happening. As I say, it doesn't happen often, but where it does happen, you know, we are there to provide that intervention and to provide that program of support to try and, you know, prevent reoffending. It isn't often, but when it does, we reach out with both hands and offer that support.
I think it's really important, isn't it, though, because breaking this cycle of abuse, you know, if let's say we help and support the victim of a perpetrator, and that person is able to move on with their lives, and that perpetrator doesn't change their behaviour, what's the likelihood of that behaviour continuing in a new relationship and that happening over and over and over again? So we're starting, I think, to see that sort of slight shift in emphasis about prevention, stopping that reoffending, stopping that escalation as well as, you know, continuing all the fantastic work that our staff team do in terms of supporting victims and of their families. There is that shift now much more, I think, and I sense it, to breaking those cycles. But as Charlotte said, it's hard, and, you know, if domestic abuse is hard, and talking about that, a perpetrator talking about what they've done is you know, it's just as harder.
What are the legalities if a perpetrator, and I put the information because I've never thought about this, if a perpetrator came to you and said, oh, I think I am the person that is causing the abuse, from the legal side of it, is that something you'd have to report? Because that's the other part of it. If it's a case of actually you might report it, why would a perpetrator then come forward? If you can see what I'm trying to get to.
That's a tricky question. The likelihood of anyone calling us up and saying, I've perpetrated abuse, and then giving their name and all their information is really, really slim.
Yeah, of course.
So the likelihood of that happening is quite low. I mean, we do have a duty to report if we know a crime's happening, or if we've witnessed a crime, we do have a duty to report these things.
Going back to the South Asian community, in the past, it has, like we started off, in fact, on the podcast, talking about the fact that men do tend to be what were the financial stability and so on and so forth. Although that's changed, again, it tends to, the number of men that that you have said come to the service is a lot lower than the number of women. Do you think, from your experience, there is a difference in the domestic abuse that goes on in the South Asian community compared to others?
Definitely do see some quite high risk cases that come from the South Asian community. And I know we spoke a little bit about, the so-called honour-based abuse and, honour killings and things like that. We have seen some very high risk cases come through like that. And we are very mindful to make sure that, if there is an element of this happening, that we do make a referral to make sure that we get multi-agency professionals involved with these cases. Yeah.
But it does tend to, I mean, it sounds like the cases that do come in front of you are the ones that would be high risk, and perhaps everyone that, I don't know what you'd classify as high risk, medium risk and low risk, but they tend to be the ones that aren't using the services unless it got that extreme. Is that correct in what I've concluded there?
I would think that's probably right. I would have thought, I don't know because the numbers are so small, but from what I know about the referrals, particularly into refuge, I would say the service users that we see would tend to be from the higher risk end of the work that we do from the South Asian community, yes. So all those victims that are out there that are experiencing domestic abuse aren't potentially getting help and support that is out there, because perhaps in their minds they don't perceive the risk.
I also think there is an element of, the people that we support, they get to breaking point, and I think when they get to that breaking point and they think actually enough is enough, and often when children are involved, sometimes when the abuse turns to the children, I think sometimes that can be a breaking point as well. And I have supported a lot of women who've said to me, when it comes to my children, that's it. The line is drawn, and I'm going to go out and get that support. So I think that's when we do see when the risk really elevates, is that we are looking at people then saying, well, no, enough's enough, and I'm going to come through and I'm going to seek out that support.
Do you ever come across cases where the victim has come to you for support and the children kind of blame the female? Or I'm just assuming here, I'm doing what we said at the beginning, just making the assumption that it's a female, blame their mother, for example, for breaking up the family? Has that ever happened?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. It does. And I think, a lot of domestic abuse, especially when we're thinking about that coercive control, gaslighting, where victims have been made to feel like it's their fault, and a lot of what goes on, sometimes it will happen away from the children's view. So one of the things that we really welcome with the Domestic Abuse Act is that children are recognised as victims. So if children are hearing or seeing domestic abuse, is that they are recognised as victims. However, often we have families that come through to us and they say, well, the children were never there. So the children don't know about it, or they'd wait till the children are out of the house, or, and then something happens. And then I think as mums are very, very good at putting on a front. So I think, when children come back into the home, that, the makeup is back on, the mask is back on, and often a lot of that can be hidden. And I think sometimes in those cases is that the children, either they're too young to understand, or if they haven't witnessed it or they haven't seen it, is that it would be very easy for them to sort of blame mum for taking them away from the parent. And again, that's often a barrier as well to reporting, or a barrier to seeking out support, is that I've heard people say my children will hate me. I'll let my children down. And I often hear that he's a good dad. And we have a conversation around, actually, good dads don't allow their children to experience, to have these awful experiences. And actually, good dads don't treat mums that way, so actually, yeah, there is an element of sometimes of the non-abusive parent almost becoming a victim, because because they're having to explain to their children why they're not living with dad anymore, or why they're suddenly plucked out of their bed in the middle of the night to come and live in refuge. And yeah, it is really difficult, and that is part of the work that we do as well with the young people.
From your experience I keep going back to the South Asian community, but again, looking at the family, and if the victim does decide to, raise this and say, look, this is domestic abuse, I do want to leave this relationship, what kind of a response from the cases that you've seen have their family supported them?
Not often. I think especially when we have ladies coming into refuge, it's really few and far between that they have contacts outside of the refuge. We're really lucky that they might make friends inside the refuge, and we've got staff and people there to support them, but it's not often that we find families rallying around to help.
That is very sad. I mean, this was a conversation me and Taj had a little while back, where I've seen it, I've been like, well, the families have been very supportive. And one thing Taj said, well, that's not what happens in most cases, and that shocked me. So I'm really disappointed with that answer, especially in 2022. That is a depressing thought.
Yeah.
What happens, for example, if the victim is in the refuge? What are the steps afterwards? How long do they stay? It's probably different for each case, but roughly how long would they stay in the refuge? Do you support them to eventually stand on their own 2 feet? What's the process?
So we've had ladies and families that have come into our refuge and stayed for a couple of days, and sadly, they've reconciled with their partners, but there is no time limit on it. Ideally, we want to get this woman and her family to a safe, secure home of their own as soon as we can. It might be that they come in for a month or two. We've had families stay for up to a year and maybe longer. It really is case by case basis. So whilst families are living in the refuge with us, we will support them from the minute they walk through the door. We do have a resettlement worker who will help them to get on their own 2 feet, find somewhere to live, and then help them as they go out into the community. And then once they go out into the community, then somebody from my community team will pick them up for support in the community. So we would never leave anybody until they're absolutely ready. And from the off, it's about empowerment. So it's about empowering women to make their own choices, to have that stability and stand on their own 2 feet. And of course, supporting male victims in the community as well. The service is exactly the same. We want them firstly, we want them safe. Secondly, we want to get that education and that understanding, and then thirdly, we want to make sure that they've got everything that they need to be able to move on, recover, and then lead a happy and safe life, really.
One of the things our staff are, I think, really, really good at is when somebody comes to live with us in refuge, they get a key worker attached to them, and that person will help and support them on that journey, however long that takes, as Charlotte said. And when the time's right for them and for their children, there are a couple of programs that we run with our service users that help them with that journey of recovery, moving from victim to survivor. And our staff are highly skilled at delivering those programs and working with those women and their families, because they've experienced some real trauma, haven't they? And helping them deal with that and learn to understand what's happened to them and be able to move on is really, really important. And it's such a good piece of work that the staff do, supporting those victims and their children, so they can go on and live independently. And alongside those sort of recovery programs, it's all the practical things, isn't it? It's like, where are you going to live, and where are your children going to go to school, and actually, do I need to get a different job, or do I need to get some new training and some new skills, or perhaps I should think about moving out of the area? It's all those practical things as well, alongside those awful experiences that they've had. So it's a difficult journey, for everybody, but they're helped, and their hand is held all the way through, and we do everything, as Charlotte says, at their pace.
What can we do as a community to raise awareness and create that support network, especially because of the comment that you said, Charlotte, where the family perhaps isn't supporting the victim? What can we do as a community? More specifically, a South Asian community.
So, what can you do? Wave a magic wand and it'll all disappear. Wouldn't that be lovely? We have got some fantastic people out in the community from the South Asian community that are ambassadors for our organisation. So it's a programme we run, a bit like having people in the business community that are the sort of ears and eyes for domestic abuse. We've got ambassadors from the South Asian community. We've worked particularly closely, with a lovely group of ladies from the Hindu Samaj in Swindon, who I think are starting to really build some deep relationships with us and understanding the services and helping us understand your community better. So I think my first ask would be, let's talk to many more people in your community so that we can talk about the work that we do, and so we can build that relationship, that level of trust. I think that's really important. Awareness of our services and the work that we do, and that we're here for all victims 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. There'll be somebody there. So that sort of awareness piece, I think, is really helpful. And I think, and a lot of it is practical help as well for us. So invite us to events and things that your community are doing, just so that we're visible. If you can help with things that we're doing with our service users, particularly with regard to, we have like a lot of charities nowadays, we have a charity shop, and it's in the Parade in Swindon. We are always looking for people to help us in our charity shop. Come and volunteer for a morning or an afternoon. Again, it's our front door to our services. There's posters and literature about what we do. Somebody could come in and pick up a leaflet. Somebody could come in and say, I think I might need to talk to somebody. What do I need to do? But equally, donations into the shop are always really helpful. So there's practical things you can help us with so that we can do our job and support more people, as well as the big thing is about awareness raising so that we can provide help and support to more people.
And just outside of Swindon, your work is obviously within Swindon, but unfortunately domestic abuse happens outside as well. But what could those victims and their families, where could they go outside of Swindon?
So every area will have a domestic abuse service. So I would say to anyone listening outside of Swindon is, have a look for your local services online. The domestic abuse websites are very good at, there's a button, you can exit that site and there's no trace of you having even looked at it.
Oh,
so
wow.
People can just go straight on the website, exit sharp exit, so nobody knows. I would say that calling the National Domestic Abuse Helpline is really important. So the number is 0808 2000 24/7.
We'll make sure those contact details are put up on our social media and direct them to your own as well.
What can also happen on that website is if you're looking for refuge, you can actually make an application on there for refuge space anywhere in the country, and they will call back within 48 hours, or you can put in a selected time that you want them to call you back that's safe.
Also, all those numbers that Charlotte's mentioned and that sort of information you could find on our Facebook page. That's where we post a lot of information about the work that we're doing, and that our Facebook tag is at SWA Domestic Abuse.
So before we finish up this podcast, can you add one last bit of advice that you find would be so important for the victims and their families that might be listening to this?
I just really want to get the message out there that, we will work with you. Do not sit at home thinking about language barriers or, immigration status and things like that, because we will work with you to help you. There's nothing we can't overcome, and we will always try to, shape the support to suit you. So, whatever you're thinking might be a barrier, it's unlikely to be a barrier, and we can help.
So, on that point, ladies, I want to say a massive thank you in regards to the awareness that you've raised and the fantastic work you're doing. I think, one of the things from the South Asian community is perhaps no one will understand, or, they've probably never heard of this. But it sounds like you have heard of all of these barriers. So it is really important that you do get in touch with whichever service is local to you. The services have adapted so much over the years. Things like the website where you can exit quickly, things that I hadn't, wouldn't be thought of, but that are so practical. So on that point, thank you very much for joining us. And we will be tagging in on our social media your own services, so Swindon Domestic Abuse Support Services. That's goodbye from me.
And that's goodbye from me.
Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, changing_suits, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.